All right, good evening. Welcome to the audience. And welcome to the Sewer Utility District Commission meeting. Let's have a roll call.
Commissioner Strelchek's not here. Commissioner Bushy?
Here.
Commissioner Meyer?
Here.
Commissioner Worth?
Here.
Commissioner Giral is not here. Commissioner Hawkins?
Here.
Commissioner Schneider?
Here.
Commissioner Nervin?
Here.
Commissioner Abendraw?
Here, we have a quorum. And the first item is the approval of meeting minutes of February 13th.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes are approved. Resolution 3506, establishing a policy for exempting properties from the City of Mequon Sewer Tax District.
Good evening. We're here tonight to discuss a potential policy item. The city has a sewer service area that is defined and approved by MMSD, which defines all of the properties within the city that are allowed to connect to sanitary sewer service. However, the city has a smaller actual service area, which we have defined as the sewer utility district. Tonight we're here to discuss the potential policy that would address the taxes associated with those properties inside of the sewer service area but outside of the sewer service district. Based on some research that we did on the issue, there was a previous resolution which provided exemptions to 16 parcels. So we modeled the exemptions based on that resolution to provide an exemption based on a number of qualifications, including access to sanitary sewer service, but would take the MMSD charges for those properties in the sewer service area and put those across only the properties within the sewer utility district. So tonight we're here to have discussion on that potential policy, and of course if the direction of the commission is that we want to tax all of the properties within the sewer service area, then we don't need the resolution, and we will just update the tax records going into the 2018 tax season.
Didn't, when we exempted the properties the last time, weren't they removed from the sewer district?
No, unfortunately, a number of them are island properties that are deep enough within the sewer service area that MSD will not allow an exemption for. So anything that would be, if I can do this, anything that would be in the middle of the sewer service area at all, MSD will not provide an exemption for. So the only thing that we could do is a request of MMSD petition removal of properties that would be along the border. So if there are any of those properties that are outside of the sewer service area along that border, we could potentially petition MMSD to remove those from the sewer service area.
I thought we did that because there were some on Highland Road, and I thought we petitioned MMSD and they agreed to remove those.
They could have been. You all have a much longer history with this than I do. I just know that there are a number of properties, for example, those on Sunset and Ridge, that are within the sewer service area but do not have direct access to sanitary sewer service. So the city is being charged by MMSD for the sanitary sewer or the MMSD capital charges associated with those properties. However, those properties do not have immediate access to sanitary sewer. Those would be some of the ones that would be eligible for exemption should we decide to remove them from the sewer service area.
Alderman Worth.
I previously lived in one of the houses that straddles this, so I remember this particularly well. Along Donges Bay Road, there's a pocket of 4 homes that, in fact, we tried to get figure out what it would cost to attach a lift, and unlike John Garm's memo that's in there that said it might be $20,000 per home, it was going to be something like $140,000 for 2 homes. So, you know, because it not only would take an incredibly long sewer line, but it would also take a lift to get it to the sewer service area. Right, sir, and it's easier for me to talk about this now, since I'm not in one of these homes. It is really kind of unfair to assess sewer tax to houses that, under no rational set of circumstances, could ever get sewer. I mean, I would have liked to have had it. So I think, you know, as far as creating a policy, though, didn't we create a policy in 2016? That's what I mean, or 2006, isn't it simply that somewhere, because for...
No, it listed those 16 properties specifically.
Right, okay, but it was based on an analysis of each of them that couldn't get it.
Which is why I'm suggesting, rather than restricting that policy to those 16...
Are there more?
Yes.
How many?
How many?
There are over 80 parcels.
Okay.
Are those all fringe parcels now?
No.
So they're island parcels?
Some are fringe. And tonight we were trying to get from the commission whether you agreed to the principles of the policy or not. And if you move forward, then what we would do is bring forth the proposed amendment to the sewer utility district based upon that map, so that you can see where all of those properties are located. And obviously, if you decide that we want to remove the fringe properties from the sewer service area, we can petition MMSD to remove those, but the island properties cannot be removed from the sewer service area.
See, I thought there were some island properties that in a separate resolution had been exempted also at one point. That this wasn't what you have attached, where it was kind of done in, I thought, there were 2 separate resolutions back then.
I remember that, yeah.
And that the island properties were more, you know, it was a little more discussion, or, but some of them were even clearer cut that it made absolutely no sense. I thought there were more than these 16 properties that had been exempted at one point. As far as I'm concerned, the policy makes sense, assuming, does the policy provide that if, you know, well, at least for the island properties, if things change, we could change the policy?
Correct. And obviously, if any of them were provided connection, then they would be subject to the tax, like all of those that connect.
My concern in exempting out properties along the fringe that, you know, the 200 feet restriction makes sense, but from a policy standpoint, do we also want to look at, is it likely or probable that the city will add sewer next to it at some point and want to put them back in?
Well, and that's where we wanted to, again, ideally discuss the principles first and then bring back the map so that we can kind of zoom in on all of those areas and discuss the merits of whether they should be in or out of the district. For example, we have a number of properties on the northern end of Lakeshore Drive, and I apologize for the scale of this map, but a number of properties that are on the north end of Lakeshore Drive. It is impractical for us to be able to serve the properties via gravity storm sewer. It's at the upstream-most portion of the system. Providing an extension of the existing main really wouldn't be able to serve the properties absent individual grinder pumps for all of the properties. And while that could be a policy decision to move forward and understand that that's how all of those properties could be served, for the time being, the majority of them are on private systems. However, in the last few years, as some of the properties have turned over in ownership or some of the private systems have failed, they've come to the city and asked to be able to connect. So now we have a series of homes with grinder pumps, individual force mains that connect into that northernmost manhole that are on the sewer system. if we removed them from the sewer service area, they would not be provided that opportunity. The answer would just be that they cannot be provided with service. So allowing them to remain in the sewer service area provides them with that opportunity, even though we wouldn't necessarily obligate them to connect given the feasibility of their connection. But they've made the distinct decisions to spend the money to put in the grinder pump and the force mains to be able to connect to the public system.
Do you know if these 16 properties were removed from MMSD's tax roll?
No.
No, they were not.
Is that in the memo?
Because I know we petitioned MMSD to do that, and there are two things in their response. One was that these properties benefit from being in the sewer service area because of clean water that's created by the sewage district, blah, blah, blah. The environmental benefits of being a part of the sewer district. So they're actually getting a benefit. They don't have to pay for sewer service, but they're paying taxes for the benefit that they're receiving in terms of clear water. That was one thing. The other thing was that if they ever were put back into the sewer service area, they would have to pay back those taxes. And when you look at this list and you see the properties on Freistadt Road, for example, and you recall a couple years ago when Mr. Weichert was going to put in a subdivision and he was going to use sewer, those properties would have been across the street from sewer. So they would have been added back in.
But that was in our policy. That wasn't with the MMSD that said that. We said, look, you 16 properties, you want this relief.
I think MMSD said if these properties get added back in by you, the city of Mequon, then we expect that tax dollars to be paid back.
That was our debate.
To be clear, we are paying MMSD. So they're not being shorted for the properties that we've exempted.
Well, that's not fair to the rest of the people in the sewer district. I mean, there's a lot of unfairness here, but just because you're getting billed for something and it unfairly doesn't mean that I should pay for it unfairly.
Well, and I'll take the other side of that now that I can freely debate that. First of all, the environmental aspects was something like 15% of what they tax us for. It's a relatively small portion of the overall tax portion, if I remember it. I don't remember exactly what it is, but we wouldn't have ever created sewer except for those people who need sewer. I mean, at one point, Mequon didn't have sewer. So to impose the cost on properties that can't get it because much of the rest of the city needed it didn't seem fair. And so we actually created that policy. That was the compromise to get this done, that said you properties, and I think there were more than 16. I do think there was another resolution. But you properties that are getting exempted, if you ever can get back in, want to get it back in, or whatever for connecting, you're going to have to pay back the amount of tax that was foregone. I mean, that was the resolution that was passed back in 2006 by us, not imposed by MMSD. In fact, if you read the memos carefully, it says it was too late in the year to go and petition MMSD to have it exempted. I think there was always the expectation that maybe we would do that later, but it never happened.
And that is in the ordinance,
Right.
that the city of Mequon will continue its negotiations with the MMSD relative to the removal of taxable value of these parcels from the MMSD annual capital invoice.
Yeah, and I don't think it ever really happened.
Doesn't
but-
stop us from doing it now.
Unfortunately, I can't speak to that.
Right.
Well, and this resolution doesn't prohibit us from continuing to do that. However, even if we decide to remove properties from the sewer service area, that's a 6 to 9 month process, and that also may be too late for this year's tax bills. So we're looking to have a policy to be able to address those. And again, even if we decide to petition MMSD for the removal of properties, obviously once they're outside of the sewer service area or otherwise exempted from the capital costs, then we wouldn't otherwise charge them for it. But there is the issue of the city currently being charged for it and whether that gets passed through to those properties or not.
how did we decide, how did you decide to exempt the 75 properties at the end of last year, or
It-
to have it covered?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it was based upon historical tax bills, that it was
Yeah, and I'm
for-
wondering how the, whatever that be, 59 properties, for example, I know that one guy on Bear Road had contacted me upset that all of a sudden he had a sewer charge, and then happy that the sewer charge went away. Interesting that I think at one point he worked for the sewer district. But,
Well, Fred,
you know, he, or at least did work on sewer stuff. But I didn't really realize, and I didn't have an objection one way or another, but how did those other 59 historically not get taxed? Do we know?
I can't speak to that.
See, I think somewhere there's another resolution hanging out there somewhere.
I think there is.
Dealt with a bunch of additional
We
properties.
couldn't find, again, I
Yeah.
obviously
Because
don't
I
have
remember one
the
instance on
history
it there.
that you do, but we couldn't find any other exemption on record. I will
That's the
fully
reason
state
for
that that
keeping
doesn't mean there's
records.
not one. We just couldn't
Yeah.
locate it.
No, and because that would be weird that a bunch of people just historically wouldn't have gotten charged. It was a big debate here. I think Mr. Sider actually led the charge to exempt those 16 properties back in 2005. So, as far as the general policy, I mean, my comment is great idea, but I guess I'd like to see how it actually plays out with the map, if that's all we're being asked to consider tonight.
We have the policy before you again, not knowing what the tone of the conversation was going to be. We didn't necessarily want to go through the exercise of defining the map if in the end the direction from this body was that you wanted to tax all of the properties within the sewer service area, because then we don't need a map. So we would just use this one. But if the direction is that you agree with the policy, then we can go through and identify. The intent of this one is to be all inclusive, so we don't keep exempting certain properties and then have other modifications that maybe change conditions. So because the current ordinances already allow for regular approval of the sewer utility district map, our intent was that would be the basis of determining which properties provide exemptions or not. So if you want to table this discussion until we get that map back, as long as you agree in principle with what's outlined, then we can certainly come back with that map. Again, if the direction from this body was not to enact such a policy, then we would not need said map.
So explain to me quickly why we have to change the boundaries, though, to do that.
We don't have to. We're just looking for a mechanism to be able to distinguish between the properties that will be taxed and those that won't. So staff is proposing that we would do that by having those properties within the sewer utility district be the one that are charged for the MMSD capital charges, and that those that are outside of the sewer utility district but still within the sewer service area would not be charged those fees.
Right, but you plan on moving the lines designated by within 200 feet of a,
For the sewer utility district, yes.
Our own internal lines, not MMSD lines.
right.
Hold- Commissioner Hawkins.
So just to simplify things, and I think we would all agree that anybody who's not being serviced by our sewer utility should not be taxed. I think we'll all agree to that. If we were to shrink the square foot, the area of the current utility, does that mean that the city's tax bill from MMSD would shrink as well?
No.
No, okay, so the city's tax bill is going to remain the same.
Correct.
It's just, are we going to allocate that money to people who are currently being serviced
Correct.
or in the future being serviced, as opposed to those who are not? I think that's fair.
To clarify one thing you said, though, I don't think staff is suggesting that people who don't have sewer aren't going to share in that. It's people who don't have sewer and are too far away from sewer to be practical to ultimately get it.
Correct. To kind of mix my utility
Yeah,
terms.
okay, that's fine.
For sewer customers that are on Main not using. So, for example, the Central Growth area, when we went through and on Wauwatosa Road extended that sewer, there is now service available to a good number of parcels that didn't previously have access. They have laterals run to their property line. So they have all the access in the world, but we decided as a part of that policy not to require connection. So they have the ability to connect, but they don't have we didn't at the time compel requirement to connect. We have the right by ordinance to do so.
But
We
should
haven't
they connect, you're going to
exercise that.
Yeah.
But should they decide
Yeah,
to
that's
connect, it's obviously available. So they are being charged for
Okay,
the
that's fine.
MMSD capital
No,
charges.
that's fine. I think that's fair.
Likewise, I guess just to give another example, properties that go under deferral agreements. So if there's a land division or a development that comes forward and they request an exemption for sewer connection, those deferral agreements require payment of the MMSD capital charges.
Okay.
So that would be another example of some of the properties that would be included in the district.
We are not really the body that's taxing these people. We're passing through this bill from MMSD. This
Correct.
comes,
Or
this comes,
MMSD, yes.
yeah, this is an MMSD bill. And what you're suggesting and what some people are suggesting is that we chip in and pay a bill that someone's getting from somebody else. I see zero fairness in that.
But
My
that's not
neighbors,
accurate.
my neighbors should not be paying your sewer tax bill just because you're too far to get away from the sewer.
But that's not accurate. They aren't taxing individual properties. They're taxing the district. They're sending a district tax. We could allocate that however we wanted to. We could put that into user charges. We could, I mean, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, we
So
could. That
it's-
was a
it's-
big argument in the sewer wars.
Right.
But the bill comes based on the value of the property. And
Correct,
that's the
based
way
on
the
the assessment.
so that's the way the bill should be paid.
Well, we made that decision 13 years ago, at least to some degree, not to.
More than that.
What?
Probably more than, we made that during the sewer wars. We
Well, in
made-
2005, when we exempted at least those 16 properties.
Right.
And I believe at some point we exempted another 59 properties. That policy,
I
we'd
don't-
actually have to vote to unexempt those. We have an existing resolution. It's not like we can just put them back on the tax rolls because staff decided to. There's a resolution that was already decided by the council, signed by the mayor, that exempts
which
those
mayor?
properties.
Not this mayor.
Not this mayor, it was in 2005. You voted on it. Don't know whether you voted yes or no, but there was definitely a vote.
I probably made the same arguments because it's the same subject.
Let's go back to the recording.
Should the minutes say somewhere who voted which way.
So the amount of exempt properties has increased over the years, and are there other areas that possibly could be islands that are buildable that we should have maybe something in the plans for them to be built, that they are informed that they will be paying the sewer? Instead of that increasing role getting bigger and bigger? And I don't know if there's a lot of land that still can be done on, but
You mean, should we be making a policy decision to extend sanitary sewer to those properties?
no.
Oh.
No, what I'm saying is that if right now, we started out like 18 properties, and I'm thinking there was a lot more that were exempt at that time. But it probably has grown since then for some properties. Should we be having some kind of policy in the future, some kind of development policy that says to the fact that if you're building inside one of these island areas, and that you're still gonna be subject to the sewer? Because this is coming in after the fact?
Well, you're stretching me right now, but to a certain extent, for new development within the sewer service area, we do have that requirement So if there was what we would define as new development, there would be a require for either an exemption or a request of this body for a deferral, which again is a part of the deferral agreements. We then require the payment of those MMSD properties.
Even if it's like an individual residence that gets built inside of one of these island areas, would still be in their agreement that they would still have to pay the sewer.
Yes, well, and again, unfortunately, as maybe tonight is a good example, at some point it becomes very difficult to track individual resolutions that provide exemptions for 16 properties, 59 properties, whatever it is. So the biggest goal behind this was to be able to establish the policy based on principles. And then we would have the map that would be associated with this, that this body can approve as often as needed. So to your point, if a property within that island area connected and had previously been exempt, that would be a trigger for us to bring that map back before this body to move that map boundary and say that that property should be included and therefore subject to the MMSE charges. But then we wouldn't have to make any more policy decisions. We would just amend the boundary to the map.
My actual question was for new development.
Right, so new development within the sewer service area is already required to
Even if it's a single family.
connect. Well, if it's an undeveloped property and they're doing new construction, yes, they are required to connect.
Okay.
Or to come forward and get a deferral from this body.
Okay.
Caradell Lane is an example of that's happened within the last 2 years. There are 2 homes that have deferrals because in the end they requested an exemption, but they have a deferral agreement that requires them to pay the MMSD capital charges.
Why is it easier to keep track of those than resolutions?
Those with deferral agreements, I think finance would argue it's not. Frankly, this was a long time coming in terms of us even trying to go back and figure this out. So I'm not sure it was, but that's where, again, the idea would be that the map would help us all in that.
So there's more than 16 properties now that are not paying the tax,
Correct.
and we don't know why that is. John says there's a resolution,
I
but
thought, I'm not.
There could be. Again, unfortunately, it was difficult to go back. I kind of thought it was good that we found this one. You might have all known about it, but 2006 predates me here, so I didn't. But we were able to go back and find this one. But again, the idea was that with the new policy, that we don't have to track individual exemptions, even if there is one on the record for the other 59 properties, except that math doesn't really work, so the other 41 properties.
Commissioner Gross,
I speak to this issue.
go right ahead. He's been here longer than anybody. He's offering to pay.
Yeah, everybody's.
All right, I live on Shoreland Parkway, and it looks like I'm included in your map there. However, some years back when I did work on my house, lifted it up, they made me abandon my septic system and put a holding tank in it at a pretty high cost. At that time, I went to the city engineer, I think it was Bill Hoppy at the time, and I said, well, what are the chances that sewer's going to come down the street? Because I don't want to spend this money, and then 2 years later, you get the idea to put sewer down, I'm going to pay money again. And he said, sewer's never going to come down your street. Number one, it's in the floodplain, so water would possibly get into the system. And number two, it will require a lift station, and we're never going to build a lift station for just that street. So at this point, it looks like, we're never going to have it. So I'd have a hard time being included in any tax payments for that.
We're not suggesting, this is just the sewer service area.
You're not in it.
I'm not in it?
Well, unfortunately,
Sure he
again,
is.
the
You're right.
map is outdated, but if you're not getting taxed right now. We're not suggesting that we
Okay,
you
but I think I'm in that area though, aren't I?
Yes, you are in the sewer service area.
Okay.
And we cannot exempt you because Shoreland Parkway is somewhat in the middle of this area here. So that's where we're proposing that you would be outside of the sewer utility district and
Okay.
therefore not charged taxes because you are more than 200 feet away from sanitary sewer.
Okay, so that's not on the table then. Okay, that's what I need. Thank you.
So you're paying the sewer tax now?
No.
No.
You're not. So you should be. You're not on this list.
Or he's one of the other
It's one of,
59
on
properties.
Don
in
Worth's
there.
resolution,
The mystery
one of the
resolution.
mystery resolution.
I think we should request, find out all the properties that
Okay.
can't be sewered and request MMSD come here and explain why they're taxing us for those properties. Why they won't exclude us. Then we'll at least have that side of the story.
Do you want them to come here or do you want that response as a part of the next meeting?
Yeah, write them a letter or get a reply.
Well, and, well, we don't have the city attorney here, but, I mean, the interim direction could be, we can petition MMSD again to remove those properties. Our concern, and this resolution would really just need to come ahead of the tax season. My concern is just, again, MMSD's approval rate for such requests is typically in the 6 to 9 month process, and at 9 months, the finance department is at least starting to think about the generation of tax bills again. So we can certainly take another stab at exempting those properties ahead of approving this resolution.
Well, we have to start the process at some time. I mean, at some,
Well, and I'll have to go back to look, well, no, if we're not petitioning to remove them for the sewer service area and all we're doing is petitioning them to be exempt from the capital charges, then I don't think I need a resolution from this body. I can just petition MMSD for that. It would only be if we were removing them from the sewer service area.
And you
Very
don't want to do
confusing me
that
there.
because then in the future, if
Well, that's
they choose,
that's a
then they
bigger
can't.
policy decision because again, if we remove them from the sewer service area, then they cannot connect. And while it may not be feasible for them to connect, again, with the example of the properties on the northern end of Lakeshore Drive, I'm sure most of them would have said prior to having any issues with their septic systems, no, we don't want to be in the sewer service area. We don't want to have to pay the charges until their system failed. And they realized that the cost of replacement, excuse me, exceeded the cost of them putting in a lift station and in most cases, an inch or two force main into our existing system. And now they don't have to have a private system. So if we petitioned MMSD for removal of the properties to the sewer service area, that would still not address all of the properties. So we would still need a policy to address the fees for the other properties.
So Director Lundin, to pick up on your comment earlier, if the commission is not comfortable approving the resolution here tonight, that does not preclude staff from going back and completing the map exercise as contemplated in the memo, and then bringing that back for further discussion, review, consideration at a future Sewer Utility Commission district meeting, correct?
Certainly, or as an interim step at the direction of the commission, I can not only I can first petition for removal of those properties from the MMSD capital charges, get the response from MMSD regarding that, and then react from there. And if everyone agrees with the mayor, that should provide us with that answer in terms of why they won't. That that request and subsequent denial, if that's what happens, would provide us with that rationale. And then if the direction is that we would come back with the policy and the map, of course, with that justification from MMSD, then you could take action at that point.
I think we should also have a list of all the properties that we're talking about here, not just the 16.
Right. Yes, the map would be what we'd be officially asking for approval of, but we could include a table of those properties that are within the sewer service area that are exempted, so that the commission has that for consideration.
Can you also note in any of those cases that they would still be within that 200 meter distance?
Well, I guess that's where we were looking for direction tonight in terms of what we would be basing that on. So we would be basing that on the 200 feet unless we were given direction otherwise.
Seems kind of close. Commissioner Ward.
I think a couple points. If we're going to do this and it may change status in any method, any part of the status of any of these 60-some or 70-some properties or 80 properties, whatever it is, from what they currently are, perhaps they ought to get notice of this before we have a discussion about it. If they're going to potentially get an increase, have it added back to their tax bill, or if it's going to be where they're carved out of MMSD's taxable area, potential future sewer service district areas. That's one point. I mean, we really ought to let
Yes.
those people know.
There would be if we amended the sewer service area boundary, there would be a large public outreach effort associated with that.
But also
All I'm
we-
suggesting at this point is we would petition exemption of the capital
Sure.
charges.
Sure. Second, but also if we were to rescind the existing one resolution and what we think might be another resolution by a new resolution that would change their status, I think people ought to know.
To put them in.
Yeah, if that was going to be the amendment.
Well, and I
so
think we
that's-
already had a process, though, that included several, because the ones on Wauwatosa Road with the new policy, when we extended Wauwatosa Road, they are now included in the sewer service area.
We also, if we pass a resolution, perhaps we ought to reference that it replaces the old resolution, so
Okay.
that there's no someday some inconsistency or a question about,
Sure.
what we've got these two resolutions
And-
dealing with the same matter. If there's a little inconsistency, how do we deal with it?
And we'll do that in case there are other resolutions that we did not find, so that it's clear that this replaces those as well.
And third, there's at least one, maybe two areas of future service, MMSD sanitary sewer district expansion that we've considered, the eastern growth area,
Correct.
part of the western growth area,
Yes.
like for example, along the side of on Swan Road.
Yes.
Maybe if we're going to ask them to remove if we go to the point where we actually ask them to remove properties from their district, we give them a kind of but in exchange we'll add this to it. So you're not, if you're adding some property and taking some out and they're not going to lose any revenue, maybe they're more likely to look at that.
Yeah, MMSD is not generally, I mean, if the city wants to remove property, as long as we're indicating that we are not going to serve those properties with sanitary sewer, they're not necessarily going to oppose it.
Okay.
And obviously, on the flip side, part of the reason that we don't go through the process of expanding the sewer service area ahead of development is because then they are subject to the MMSD capital charges. And if there's not yet development on those properties, then they're
Sure.
subject to those fees, which was a large portion of the discussion when the central growth sewer service area went. But to your point, there was a large amount of public input and discussion as a part of that in terms of what the implications were, not the least of which was the charge for the MMSD capital charges.
Alderman Meyer.
Yeah, just one final thing. Is the 200-foot distance appropriate? Because in 2006, and I was reading through it, some of the reasons that we didn't include those people on because they were over 100 feet away.
Well,
So
the
is-
200 feet comes from the existing code requirement. So if we want to go back through and amend the ordinance, I was just trying to be consistent with our existing ordinances on record, which is where that 200 feet comes from.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but I'm saying like the Freistadt roads, the two that, or the four that were exempt, service for them was over 100 feet away. Now, it could have been 190 feet. I don't know what it is at that area, but are we now, since we say it's 200 feet, are we including those properties then into that?
Well, I'm happy to go, once we go through the map exercise, I'm happy to either consider adding, in fact, we should add language that those that were previously exempted would, well, assuming that the direction of this commission is that those properties that were previously exempted would continue to be exempted, so that those considerations that were made as a part of that resolution are stayed, but that we're defining moving forward consistent with the ordinance on record. So I can include an additional clause about that. And maybe that's where one of these whereas statements should actually be moved down into the policy, because it does talk about feasibility of access. And there may certainly be some that are within 200 feet but can't feasibly receive
Yep.
service, and we would suggest those be exempted.
Okay, we looking to table this and bring it back?
Move the table?
Second.
I know that's
Motion
not
second.
debatable, is that tabling with direction to petition MMSD to remove the capital charges?
And bringing back the map,
Yes.
explaining which ones they are, yes.
Okay.
Motion and a second to table? Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The item is tabled. Looking for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Motion second to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? We are adjourned. We'll now convene the meeting of the Mequon Municipal Water Utility Commission and have a roll call.
Commissioner Strelchuk is not here. Commissioner Bushy,
Still here?
Commissioner Meyer,
Still here? Yeah, here.
Commissioner Worth,
Here.
Commissioner Giro is not here. Commissioner Hawkins.
Here.
Commissioner Schneider,
Here.
Commissioner Nervin,
Here.
Commissioner Avendra.
Here. We have a quorum. First item is meeting minutes of February 13th.
Move approval.
Second.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes are approved. Next item is meter study.
The city water put together a meter study based upon the direction of the master plan that was previously before the commission in the fall. It's there in a good amount of detail. Jim Voigt is here to answer those questions, should you have any. We included the summary of the recommendations, which if the commission tonight adopts the meter study as a reference tool and management for staff, we would subsequently bring back either purchases or additional projects for approval of this commission for authorization of spending.
Commissioner Worth.
In the study, they note that meters have to be replaced every 20 years unless there is a testing program in place. It didn't really address whether we want to have a testing program in place or why we don't.
That's a good question. The way PSC 185, the billing code reads, is the typical replacement schedule for water meters is every 10 years. But they will allow for up to 20 years, basically if your meters are accurate to that date or if you intend on replacing them. And so we have gone with 20 years because meter reading technology that we currently utilize, it has a radio with a battery, and those batteries last 18, 20 years, somewhere in that time frame. So at that point in time, you need to get into the home in order to replace the battery. So there's a lot of work involved with, scheduling with a resident to get into their house, to go in to add a meter. So rather than pull a meter out to test it, just to replace the meter at that point in time makes the most sense. The meters themselves are the smallest cost associated with the actual meter radio register. The radio and register cost probably about $147, somewhere in that neighborhood. The meter itself is just around 50. So it just makes most sense to swap the meter out at the time that you have to get into the house.
I move approval.
Second.
Motion to approve, second?
Right here.
Second? Okay, any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Well, that was easy.
Well, I know far too much on meters now.
Water Trust Connection Policy Update.
We wanted a lot of policy discussion tonight, so we've brought back before this commission a revised version of the private water trust connection policy. Some of the feedback that we heard from the commission last time was both with respect to the technical nature of the policy itself and with concerns as to whether or not the private trusts would want to connect or want to go through the condition assessment to determine what their financial obligation would be to connect without really understanding what their potential financial obligation would be. So in response to that, we not only tried to simplify the policy language itself, but we created first step-by-step instructions and then also an interactive spreadsheet that while the private water trusts would have access to do some of their own analysis, what we hope it would result in is a dialogue between the private trusts and the utility about what their opportunity costs are for such a connection. So we have it up tonight. I'm happy to walk through it in any amount of detail that you may want to. But the intent, again, was to show the step-by-step process of the condition assessment, that while that ultimately is required for petitioning connection, the private water trust could really go through and make some assumptions based upon what they know of their own system and select the different rating system based upon what they want to do. And of course, the more conservative they are, the higher the potential construction cost, or the more they assume the system is in good condition, obviously the less the cost. But again, the intent would be for them to at least have a means to determine what the potential financial risk would be, and more specifically give us the tool to be able to respond to private trusts about what the financial obligation would be. We went through a lot of this last fall when we discussed this policy, so we're happy to dig in more detail again if you want to, but otherwise we're here tonight to either run through the spreadsheet if that's what you want, or otherwise discuss some of the policy implications or accept approval if that's what you're.
Well, it affects your district the most, I think.
It affects my neighborhood potentially.
Yeah.
Have we gotten any feedback from any of the trusts? Have they seen this, or
No.
we're trying to?
We
know-
needed your authorization
Okay.
to be able to use this. However, to be clear, while this is intended to be a tool, if we find that it's cumbersome or there are things that could be, more clear, we're obviously happy to work through iterations. We just wanted to use this as the kickoff, so to speak, to be able to have those discussions and exercises.
I think having it in a spreadsheet format where people can play with it and try and assess themselves, it addresses one of the hurdles that was brought forth last time. At least gives them a mechanism to anticipate the range of potential costs You could do one conservative, one not so conservative, and at least bound it. Right now, there's just a big unknown for a lot of these trusts. And I
We'll
think
note
that's,
that
that's,
while
a-
we-
that's been an issue.
I will note that while we tried to give you a good range of values in that packet, that there was a minor math error, so nobody published that to Beechwood Farms as the official numbers. We'll update that before we have those discussions with them.
I did think to pass that along because I thought it was preliminary, but I'm glad I didn't know.
Is there an ultimate arbitrator in this, or?
An ultimate arbitrator?
Arbitrator for, I mean, if there's, the city says it's gonna cost this for it, they disagree.
Yes, at this point, the policy states that it would all be negotiated as a part of the water services agreement, which is ultimately approved by this body. So you are the ultimate arbitrator. I mean, at some point, again, it's a matter of negotiation. We're trying to assume to the best of our ability what the utility's financial risk is in accepting the private trust. And of course, they can try and provide evidence to the contrary or negotiate for a different price. And ultimately, then this body gets to decide what those terms are.
The beauty of the spreadsheet that we set up is it's based on standard Public Service Commission depreciation tables, and it's also based on our tariff and the costs that we have in our tariff for water main extensions and things of that nature. So it's all extremely defendable. It's basically simple math. And the reason that we're asking for this is, interestingly enough, we're in year 9 of the water utility, but all the connections that we've had to date have been covered by our tariff. Either it's a new subdivision, new development, so they're building all the infrastructure, or it was an existing private well system, so we had to build all the infrastructure, or it was an old ductile iron system like Century States 3 or Laurel Acres, where it was fully depreciated and they knew they had to replace it. So the issue of condition assessment of the existing water main was never an issue. It's only now that we're dealing with water systems and water trusts where it's not fully depreciated. It is somewhere in the middle. And that's where we as the utility are like, well, we need something to help guide us on how do we evaluate, how do we come up with that dollar figure. And that's what we created the spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet is the blue cells you can play with, but everything else is locked out such that, I mean, the water trust can go in and, start monkeying around with it. And the only thing that can really change are the unlocked cells. So it makes it very easy for them to get a feel. And from the utility standpoint, to provide them with information, to provide a water trust with information that then they can start getting an idea of, okay, so where are we at financially? Everybody makes decisions based off cost benefit. Does the cost associated with converting over, is there enough benefit in the conversion that this makes sense? That's all we're trying to do, is get that conversation started.
Question. But this is just a working document to give the trust a ballpark figure of what it might cost. I'm assuming then the city or some other entity comes in and actually assesses it more specifically, or is that not true?
Well, they would be required to hire, ultimately, as a part of the application process, should they decide that they want to move forward, then they'd be required to hire a certified operator to perform a condition assessment. And that's where the inspection checklists would be utilized, inspection checklists would be utilized to populate the values that ultimately go into this. So it would no longer be filled out by the private trust and would be filled out by the certified operator. The idea being that there is less argument than whether that assessment is valid or not.
I think it's a great document, honestly. It looks very straightforward. I can understand it. In terms of if I had to assess someone's water system, I think I might be able to do it with this document. And I think it will be really useful for them to have some idea in advance of what their commitment might need to be financially. So I like it.
I agree. I think it's pretty straightforward in that certified operator filling this out, then this becomes the mechanism for actually calculating the cost. So they can develop it as an estimate, and then if they decide to move forward, the certified operator fills it out. You have a real cost, and I assume city water would review all that to make sure they concur and everything just wasn't rubber stamped excellent. I did have one other question that's kind of doesn't affect this so much, but it's kind of a side issue. I know there's a few of the water trusts in my area that are linked together for backup purposes. And for instance, in Beechwood, we'd have to do a main extension to get into the neighborhood, which is relatively short. It wouldn't probably even be the majority of the cost. The depreciation would probably be more of the cost in that instance. If another neighborhood decided to join on, would we require them to extend the main to join in and only use the connection between subdivisions as a loop back or a parallel branch, or would they essentially just be able to tap into city water by opening the valve and then, for instance, Beechwood would bear all the cost of the main extension, but the Pines would get it for free because they're already connected by the redundant backup system? That's a question that Beechwood residents are concerned about. Is there a mechanism if someone else jumps on later, can we get some of that cost back because we're going to pay that up front?
And
Obviously not the depreciation, that's our system, but the main extension.
Right, and the utility argument back to that one, and I fully understand the question that you're raising is, Beechwood didn't pay for all the water main that got all the way down Lake Drive and made it all the way up to the intersection of Donjas Bay and Lake Road. You're only paying for the extension from the point that it stops to the entrance of your subdivision. And that's the way the tariff reads, is every subdivision pays for that main that they have to construct, but they don't pay for prior
Everything going
main
back.
extensions.
Yeah, and that argument makes sense. But I got a couple of residents that asked that question, so
Right. Oh, no, I
parroting
totally
it back.
understand.
That's why we've highly recommended they all get together, because
Well, they're
that
going to get together
distributes
a
that-
week from tonight, and I won't be able to attend because I'll be sitting in here doing this meeting. They'll be downstairs doing
The-
their meeting.
That's actually part of while the system valuation would be different, that's part of the reason that, when you look at some of this, you can take that main and either divide it up amongst 109 properties, or I forget the
106.
total, but 106. No, I meant then if you add Pines, Haddonstone, and actually Wingate Trace, it significantly reduces that.
But we'd have to get everyone to concur at once and do it all at once, I would assume.
Right.
And that'll never happen, but it's realist. It's
Two
got no-
questions. To follow up on that question as far as the extensions of mains. So the first one pays for it and nobody else contributes?
That's how.
Subsequent?
It's the way the tariff works. It's the way pretty much most like water, sewer, all utilities, that extension is its own separate economic analysis. You don't pay back to the prior one.
But is that fair? I mean, if I I have to put in an extension at a tremendous cost because I've got to go a long distance. People who later want to hook up to it, shouldn't they be kicking in some of that cost that I put in?
What the utility allows for, we do have refund agreements for any water main extension that the water main that they're putting down Donjas Bay Road. If there were private homes on private wells along Donjas Bay Road that were along the route, that then subsequently chose to connect to that existing main with a lateral, not a main extension, but a water lateral. That we do have a mechanism called a refund agreement that we can have as part of the contract or our services agreement, that then any lateral that connects to a main that was built by a sponsor, they're called sponsors, then that goes back to the sponsor of the project. That the cost to connect to that main with a lateral goes back to the sponsor of the main. But subsequent water main extensions, those are their own separate economic analysis, and they don't pay back to the prior main extension. It's been that way from the very beginning. It's the way all utilities work.
But why? Why do I mean, I understand it's been that way since the beginning. Is that a good policy?
Well, partly is because we are a voluntary utility. And so when you're looking at the cost to connect, we can't hold back a portion of that, assuming that at some point in the future, others would connect and.
No, I know, but I pay for it because I'm hoping in the future, part of the analysis I do as a subdivision or as a developer or whomever is I'm hoping that, I'm going to put this in, but I'm passing, a whole bunch of other properties I'm fronting their cost. Why do they then get to jump on for the nominal cost of simply connecting into it?
The problem would come, how do you define the payback? Because every single main extension, so now you have someone who put the original main in from 76th Street up to County Line Road, and if everybody keeps paying them back for that original main extension that was put in the very beginning, at some point in time, they're paid back more than they ever put in the first place, which you can't do via the PSC. And then do you keep reanalyzing every single time another main extension happens? Well, now instead of getting $200 back, you get, $50 back. I mean, it would become a nightmare for the finance department to even figure it out.
Well, and maybe, Beechwood Farms, Pines, Haddonstone, Wingate, Trace are certainly the exception to the rule. There's nowhere else that this condition exists that with this singular connection could get this many properties service. However, as a part of any water services agreement negotiation, you can determine some of the terms, which could include requiring Pines or Haddonstone to extend the main down Donjas Bay Road, so there is a redundant connection. That's not what's required for them to get public water service, but we have other situations where we require people to loop the system as a part of the development. Highlander Estates, the Enclave, they're all required to provide infrastructure for a looped system, so it wouldn't be unheard of for us to require that if that's what the commission wanted.
Okay.
I don't think we're suggesting that's required, but I think we're unique because we had subdivisions go in, and I know Beechwood's got 2 wells, 2 pumps, so we're a little redundant with ourselves. Then we've got a connection to the Pines. They only have 1. So if theirs goes down, valves are open, and everyone scratches each other's back, and then Haddonstone's similarly tied in. So we're all mutually redundant, and there may be agreements that were entered into over time to make that possible, but now it makes it possible for one subdivision to pay for a main extension and get city water, and others to have no main extension required to get service. It's not a huge dollar value, but it's still a question that people care about because
Yeah, 'cause it doesn't seem totally fair.
it'll probably end up being $1,000 a house to front the cost of the main extension.
My other question is the WDNR certified operators. Who are these people? And most anybody you hire for any purpose has do they have an axe to grind, or do they tend to lean a certain direction or another direction? Do they also do installation? So are they more likely to say, hey, this is in bad shape because we'll get more work out of this?
Well,
I just am wondering what the prejudices may be of coming to the assessments.
Well, I guess 2 things from our perspective. We were trying to identify a class of professional that would be, to the extent that we could provide the arbitrator, the one that is not necessarily advocating for public utility connection, but also not necessarily advocating remaining on the public well. The idea was that we would identify the person that should be the independent party that's truly doing the valuation just on the system.
We don't select them. They have
Nope.
no connection to us.
Nope.
Yeah, that they're either, a plumber or a well driller or someone that went to the DNR and got their certification in how to operate a public water utility. So they probably operate a series of water utilities for water trusts and things of that nature.
Okay.
They all have these current, certified operators that operate their systems for them. So they're already there. They just now, would have the ability to go through and, they know what to look for. The box is broken, the valve doesn't turn, and then they can do the condition assessment that then
So they may actually be prejudiced the other direction
potentially.
against the municipal water utility, because the more area the municipal water utility gobbles up, the less potential customers they have. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't somebody who, and then I guess I'm concerned, are they fair to the utility? But, the other way I was concerned, are they going to be fair to the neighborhood?
Well-
I I just think there's always people lean one direction or another direction based on.
And that's part of like, they're gonna go through and come up with their condition assessment. And then the water utility, I mean, we've got, 5 certified operators. We can go out and very quickly pop the covers, see what condition it's in. I mean, we can do a double check of what they've provided us just to make sure that we didn't get a complete, mail it in, make sure that it's representative of what we see.
Right.
I think that double checking would be good, both for the concern of the residents and the concern of the utility. I understand why we don't want to do all of them, because private water trust might assume the utility's gonna rate it favorably to try and hook people in, and they probably wouldn't use you anyway, but no offense.
You have a motion?
Move approval.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve the water trust connection policy. Further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
It was a nice job.
A lot of work. It looks like a lot of work.
Yeah.
That's it.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Second.
Motion second to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? We are adjourned.